Welcome back to our studios here in Lahore. I'm Hamza Amjad. Now, Pakistan has called for a UN investigation into human rights violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says India is using the bogey of terror to divert the world's attention. He was addressing the 42nd session of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. India's strict curfew and communications blackout in occupied Kashmir has now entered its 37th day. Pakistan says the world must not remain indifferent to the tragedy that is unfolding in the occupied valley. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says India may once again resort to false flag operations. He warned that a genocide could be looming in the occupied territory.
I shudder to mention the word genocide here, but I must. With the respect to the Genocide Convention, the Kashmiri people in the occupied territory as a national, ethnic, racial and religious group of people face grave threats to their lives, way of living and livelihoods from a murderous, misogynistic and xenophobic regime.
Pakistan has ruled out any possibility of bilateral talks with India.
India's effort to hide its atrocities in the Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir by falsely labeling it terrorism and cross-border terrorism are shameless and indefensible. Pakistan has suggested a number of bilateral and multilateral mechanisms that would disprove India's self-serving claims.
Meeting UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Pakistan's ambassador Maliha Lodhi said a humanitarian crisis is raging in the occupied valley. Pakistan is expected to present a resolution to the Council for consideration by the end of the session on September the 27th. Now, US President Donald Trump has again offered to help Pakistan and India resolve the conflict over occupied Kashmir. India has repeatedly rejected any third-party mediation over the Kashmir dispute. And talking to the media at the White House, President Trump said he has a good relationship with both countries. He said tensions between Pakistan and India have persisted since New Delhi unilaterally revoked occupied Kashmir's special status.
Well, India and Pakistan are having a conflict over Kashmir, as you know. I get along with both countries very well. I'm willing to help them if they want. They know that that is out there.
India's lockdown has resulted in a severe shortage of food and medicines in the occupied valley. Moving on, diplomatic sources say India is planning another false flag operation inside its territory before the UN General Assembly session later this month. The Indian Army claims to have captured abandoned ships from the disputed region of Sir Creek. Indian Southern Army Commander Lieutenant General S.K. Saini said security measures are being taken. Islamabad has repeatedly warned the international community about a staged terror incident inside India. Islamabad has already told the world that India wants to use the ploy to strike Pakistan. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan said the armed forces will give a befitting response to any Indian aggression. Indian students and civil society have gathered in New Delhi to protest the illegal annexation of occupied Kashmir. Hundreds of people called India to lift its curfew as they took part in the demonstrations. The protesters held placards and marked their fingers red to express solidarity with Kashmiris. India's curfew and communications blackout in occupied Kashmir has now entered its 37th day. US President Donald Trump says he is ramping up the Afghan war after cancelling talks with the Taliban. Talks were called off after an attack in Kabul which killed an American soldier. President Trump said the US military onslaught on the Taliban is back up at its fiercest in a decade. However, Trump said he is still thinking about a drawdown of the 14,000 US soldiers in Afghanistan. Trump has reiterated that peace talks cannot continue after the insurgents claimed responsibilities for last week's attack.
When I heard, very simply, that they killed one of our soldiers and 12 other innocent people, I said, there's no way I'm meeting on that basis. There's no way I'm meeting. They did a mistake. And by the way, they are telling people they made a big mistake.
Meanwhile, the Taliban have vowed to continue fighting against US forces in Afghanistan. Taliban spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid says the US will regret walking out of negotiations. Let's move on to Britain now. The Parliament has been officially suspended for 5 weeks. Lawmakers created a ruckus in the parliament after Prime Minister Boris Johnson's call for snap elections was rejected a second time. The parliament will now reopen on 14th of October. Opposition lawmakers held signs reading "Silence" and yelled "Shame on you" at ruling Conservatives. Queen Elizabeth has approved legislation against a no-deal Brexit. But Johnson says he will not delay Brexit any further and will strive to get an agreement with the EU. North Korea has launched 2 unidentified projectiles hours after it offered to resume nuclear talks with the US. South Korea's military says the missiles were launched from South Pyongan province towards the East Sea. Seoul says its military is monitoring the situation and is ready to stop any acts that could escalate tensions. Today's tests are the 8th such launch since July. Earlier, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Pyongyang has not violated any commitments to Washington regarding weapons testing. Meanwhile, North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister Cho Son-hui said a meeting can be held with the US officials to resume talks. Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam has warned the United States against interfering in the territory's internal matters. Lam said she deeply regrets interference by foreign parliaments in the Asian financial hub's matters after fresh protests. The chief executive pledged dialogue and asked for further violence to stop, just after another weekend of violent clashes came to an end. Protesters marched to the US consulate to call on Congress to pass a bill expressing support for the pro-democracy movement. Lam added that a proposed bill by the US Congress that could strip the city of its trade privileges is unnecessary interference.
Into Hong Kong's internal affairs in terms of what we are doing under the basic law, protection of freedoms and liberties. This is totally unnecessary because we ourselves have the obligation and the duty to comply with provisions in the basic law.
The US Coast Guard have rescued 4 remaining crew members aboard a South Korean vessel which capsized off the coast of Georgia. 20 members were rescued yesterday. The cargo ship Golden Ray was disabled in the St. Simons Sound after a fire on board. Crew members drilled an opening in the ship's massive hull, first to deliver food and water and then to extract them. The entire rescue operation took 35 hours. A group of 50 US states and territories have launched an antitrust investigation into Google's dominance of the online advertising market. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton said the tech giant is threatening market competition and consumers. Paxton said the participating states have asked Google to provide documents on its advertising business. Washington, D.C.'s Attorney General Carl Racine said the investigation is preliminary and will lead to other issues, including data privacy.
50 attorney generals from different states and territories are launching an investigation into Google's potential monopolistic behavior.
Muslims around the globe are marking Ashura. The day commemorates the martyrdom of Prophet Muhammad's grandson Imam Hussein in the Battle of Karbala in Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from the world head to Karbala at Imam Hussein's shrine to mark Ashura. The procession routes are dotted with drinking stalls to keep people hydrated. Globally, Muslims mourn to remember the blockade of water to Imam Hussein's camp after a siege by enemy forces. A landmark strike by British Airways pilots over a pay dispute has entered the second day with more travel chaos. The Airways says it has decided to cancel all of the 850 flights for the day. This strike has disrupted the travel plans of hundreds of thousands of passengers. The walkout over pay by the British Airline Pilots Association follows around 9 months of failed talks. BALPA boss Brian Strutton says pilots are standing firm and will not stop unless the Airways come up with a resolution. The Airways has offered its pilots an 11.5% raise over 3 years, but the British Airline Pilots Association wants the pay deal to include profit sharing. Hundreds of Australians have fled their homes as 140 bushfires ravage parts of Queensland and New South Wales. Queensland Police Commissioner Katrina Carroll said at least 8 of the fires are suspicious and will be investigated. Queensland's acting Premier Jackie Trad said over 400 people are present at the evacuation centres. She said no deaths have been reported yet.
We've got more than 400 people currently in evacuation centres, and unfortunately we will not be able to provide advice to them to return back to their homes until proper safety assessments have been done.
The World Health Organization says suicide kills one person every 40 seconds across the world. A report has termed suicide a global public health issue.
More people die by suicide every year than in war or by homicide. A report by the World Health Organization says nearly 800,000 people die by suicide worldwide every year. It has specified hanging, poisoning, and shooting as the most common suicide methods.
So we see that there are an estimated 800,000 deaths from suicide in the world every year. And this translates to about one death every 40 seconds globally. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among the age group of 15 to 29-year-olds.
The report found that nearly 3 times as many men as women die by suicide in wealthy countries, while the rates are equal in low and middle-income countries. WHO has called for action to reduce access to suicide means, including pesticides and firearms.
When we think about access to means, we know that in the region of Americas, access to firearms and guns is an important means of suicide. And basically, we would need to look, similarly to the pesticides, whether we can arrive at the reduction of the access to such means of suicide.
Global suicide rates have fallen in recent years, but the decline is inconsistent. WHO has urged governments to adopt suicide prevention plans to help people cope with stress.
Jean Socrates has become the oldest person ever to sail around the world solo. She left Victoria back in October 2018. Let's take a look where she is now.
A 77-year-old British woman sailed into the history books and made a name for herself. She navigated the 36-foot boat into Victoria's Ogden Point in British Columbia, Canada. On her non-stop voyage, she was unassisted and spent more than 330 days alone at sea. Socrates has made several tries since 2016 to become the oldest person to navigate the globe alone. She had to abandon each try because of rough seas, boat damage, and sometimes a personal injury.
This as one of the greatest voyages of all times. A 77-year-old woman who's battled unbelievable hardships on this trip.
Hundreds of well-wishers waited for Socrates at the breakwaters of Victoria. Her close friend and fellow sailing buff Steve Illman welcomed her back at the Ogden Point. Illman said the radar dish, mainsail and the backup sail on Socrates' boat sustained damage during her voyage.
She's looking forward to having a very long hot bath and then eating a lovely meal and a nice glass of wine. Luckily, the Fairmont Empress Hotel has graciously donated that wish to her.
The septuagenarian sailor did not immediately talk to the media, but waved and smiled at her well-wishers.
And with that, we're going to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. More stories to follow. Welcome back. Now, I'm sure we do all enjoy puppetry. In Indonesia, bamboo puppetry is an art that is slowly dying. But one man's aim is to salvage the craft, modernize it, and feed the masses with local tradition. Let's take a look.
Nights in West Java are filled with excitement. Handheld puppets donning colorful headdresses and sarongs stage a fight to the rhythm of traditional music. Rajat Skandar has been lending a hand to reviving the near-extinct art of weighing bamboo, or bamboo puppetry.
I tried to portray local stories and folklore from our community with bamboo puppets. The end result was really amazing. On top of that, The stories of bamboo puppet we perform are also inspired by current affairs like brawls between students, drug problems, sexual freedom and politics, which are all issues that are widely discussed at the moment.
Skandar learned the art from his father, also a puppeteer. Now he has a full puppet troupe with an orchestra of 12 musicians. He also trains pupils.
In the past, I used to feel embarrassed, but after I learned more and participated in Sundanese arts and cultural performances, I became more enthusiastic about it.
Bookings for Iskandar's shows have steadily increased over the years, which are popular among local audiences.
Well, it's been more than 30 years since Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale. The much-anticipated sequel has been released today. Fans flocked to Waterstone's flagship bookstore in central London for a midnight reading by Atwood herself. Take a look.
Londoners were transported to Margaret Atwood's fictional estate of Gilead. It was to celebrate the launch of the Testaments. It is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, a terrifying, misogynistic dystopia set in the US in the near future. Turned into a major television series, the book has become a feminist rallying point for the Me Too generation.
I mean, how many years now is it? I don't know, 40 years, 30 years on. And actually, the world in some ways is becoming a worse place for women, and particularly in the United States. And so this is very current and very relevant and very necessary.
Handmaids donning iconic red cloaks and white headpieces march through central London. The hats and cloaks have become a symbol of feminist struggles, but they resonate with other themes too.
I didn't think of it as feminist fiction. I just thought of it as one of the best pieces of science fiction that I've read, although at the time it seemed like it was describing a future that was obviously impossible because we were all much too sensible ever to get to that place.
The show has boosted sales of the novel, which has shifted 8 million copies worldwide in English alone. It has already been nominated for the 2019 Booker Prize, one of the English-speaking world's most prestigious literary awards.
Well, first up in business, the European Union has vowed to boost Cuba's economy. EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini said the bloc will also counter a wave of lawsuits against European firms. Meeting Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel, EU top diplomat Mogherini said the bloc rejects the US activation of Helms-Burton law. The 1996 law allows Cuban Americans to recover damages from the companies that do business with the Cuban state. The provision had been waived by every former US president to avoid conflicts with European companies active in Cuba. The EU official said the bloc's investment will also help European companies consolidate their foothold on the island. US President Donald Trump has tightened sanctions against Havana over rights violations and support for Venezuela's leftist regime. Jack Ma, who's the chairman of China's e-commerce giant Alibaba, has stepped down. In an already announced transition, company's current CEO, Daniel Zhang, will replace him as executive chairman. Jack Ma co-founded Alibaba in 1999, making it one of the biggest online firms globally. Ma will stay on the company's board until his current term expires in 2020. Alibaba is now valued at $480 billion, making Jack Ma one of the richest men in China. He is also the first founder among a generation of prominent Chinese internet entrepreneurs to step down from his company. Huawei has dropped a lawsuit against the US government. The Chinese telecoms giant took the move after Washington released its telecommunications equipment. Huawei had sued the US Commerce Department and other government agencies for seizing its equipment in 2017. The company said it was informed by the US government that no export license was required to ship the gear back to China. Washington claims that Huawei equipment is a national security risk as it could be used to spy on Americans. Huawei has repeatedly denied the US allegations. Well, it's 37 degrees today here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that was all I have from the news bulletin at the moment, but do stay tuned to Indus News for further updates. And as always, thanks for watching.